Here's a question that should disturb you more than it probably does. Why must the economy grow every single year, forever, without stopping? Not why should it grow, why must it? Like a shark that dies if it stops swimming, modern economies collapse if they stop expanding. Recession, the word we use when growth slows or reverses for even 2 consecutive quarters, is treated like a national emergency. Politicians lose elections over it. Central banks panic. Markets crash. People lose their homes, their jobs, their futures. But stop and think about the absurdity of this for a moment. We live on a finite planet with finite resources. Yet we've built an economic system that requires infinite growth. Not desires it, not prefers it, requires it. The mathematics are non-negotiable. If the economy stops growing, debt compounds but income doesn't. Banks fail. Currencies collapse. The entire house of cards comes tumbling down. This isn't a bug in the system. It's the fundamental design. And most people have no idea it exists, much less why. They've been told their entire lives that economic growth is simply the natural state of things, a sign of prosperity and progress. Politicians promise it. Economists measure it. The media celebrates it. But what they don't tell you is that growth isn't optional anymore. Somewhere along the line, we crossed a threshold. We built a machine that cannot be turned off, cannot be slowed down, and cannot run in place. It must accelerate forever, or it destroys itself. And we're all trapped inside it. Fuel for an engine that mathematically cannot run forever on a planet with physical limits. For most of human history, economies didn't grow. Not in any meaningful, consistent way. A medieval farmer produced roughly the same amount of grain his grandfather did. A blacksmith made the same tools with the same techniques. Population might rise or fall with plague and famine, but the economy itself was fundamentally static. There was no expectation of endless expansion because there was no mechanism demanding it. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and everything changed. For the first time in history, productivity exploded. Steam engines, factories, railroads. Suddenly, an economy could produce vastly more than it had the previous year. But that alone didn't create the growth trap. What created the trap was how we chose to finance all this expansion. In the aftermath of World War II, at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, global leaders redesigned the international financial system. They made the United States dollar the world's reserve currency. They established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And they enshrined economic growth, measured by GDP, as the primary metric of national success. Gross domestic product became the scorecard by which every country judged itself and was judged by others. Politicians campaigned on GDP growth. Central banks adjusted policy to maximize it. International institutions measured development by it. But here's what nobody told the public. The new system wasn't just measuring growth, it was requiring it. Because at the heart of the modern financial system sits a mechanism that makes perpetual expansion mathematically necessary. Under fractional reserve banking, which became the norm globally, every dollar, every euro, every yen in existence was created as debt. Money doesn't emerge from thin air as a neutral medium of exchange. It's born as a loan, issued by a bank, owed back to that bank with interest. And therein lies the trap. If all money is debt, and all debt must be repaid with interest, where does the money to pay the interest come from? The only way the system doesn't immediately collapse is if new loans are constantly being made, creating new money to service old debts. The economy must expand because the debt underlying the money supply expands. Stop growth, and you stop the creation of new money. Stop new money, and existing debts become mathematically unpayable. The entire system seizes like an engine running without oil. Let me walk you through exactly how this works, because understanding the mechanics is crucial to understanding why we're trapped. When a bank makes a loan, it doesn't hand over money that someone else deposited. It creates new money out of nothing, typing numbers into a computer. You walk into a bank, apply for a mortgage for $200,000, get approved, and suddenly that money exists in your account. The bank didn't have it before. They conjured it into existence the moment you signed the loan documents. Now you owe the bank $200,000 plus interest. Let's say the interest over 30 years totals another $200,000. You now owe $400,000 total, but only $200,000 was created. Where does the other $200,000 come from? Someone else has to borrow it into existence. And they'll owe interest on their loan, requiring someone else to borrow more, and so on. The total debt in the system always exceeds the total money in circulation. This isn't a flaw, it's the design. It creates a mathematical requirement for perpetual expansion. As long as new loans are being made faster than old ones are being paid off, the system functions. The money supply grows. The economy expands. But the moment lending slows down, the moment people start paying down debt faster than new debt is created, the money supply contracts. And when the money supply contracts, prices fall. Businesses fail. Unemployment rises. Banks collapse. It's called a deflationary spiral, and it's what central banks fear more than almost anything. Look at the numbers. Global debt in 2022 stood at $305 trillion. That's $305 trillion worth of obligations to pay back money, plus interest. But the total global GDP, the entire productive output of every economy on Earth, was only about $105 trillion. The debt is nearly 3 times larger than the entire world's annual economic output, and it's growing. Every year, the debt grows faster than the economy because interest compounds while production doesn't. The gap widens exponentially. This is why governments and central banks panic during recessions. It's not just about jobs or stock prices. It's about preventing the mathematical unraveling of a system built on perpetual expansion of debt. The exponential nature of compound interest is where this system reveals its true impossibility. Most people understand compound interest in terms of savings accounts. You put money in the bank, earn interest, and next year you earn interest on the interest. Your savings grow exponentially. What people don't realize is that debt works the same way, except in reverse and at a much larger scale. A 5% annual interest rate means debt doubles every 14 years. Not grows by 5%, doubles. If the global debt is $100 trillion today. In 14 years, at 5% interest, it becomes $600 trillion. In 28 years, $1.2 quadrillion. In 42 years, $2.4 quadrillion. Meanwhile, economic growth historically averages 2 to 3% annually in developed nations. The debt grows faster than the economy, always. This creates an inescapable mathematical trap. To service existing debt, more debt must be created. To service that new debt, even more debt must be created. The cycle accelerates. It's not a sustainable model. It's a pyramid scheme, except the base of the pyramid is the entire global economy, and when it collapses, there's no one to bail it out. Consider what would happen if every person, company, and government simultaneously decided to pay off all their debts. Sounds responsible, right? It would be catastrophic. As debts are paid back, that money is destroyed. It's removed from circulation. The money supply would collapse. There would be no money left to conduct business, pay employees, buy goods. The economy would grind to a halt instantly. The system is designed so that being debt-free is impossible. If everyone was debt-free, there would be no money. This is why central banks desperately try to keep people borrowing during recessions, not out of cruelty, but because the alternative is systemic collapse. They lower interest rates to 0 or even negative. They print trillions through quantitative easing. They do whatever it takes to keep the debt, and therefore the money, expanding. Because in our system, money equals debt, and debt must grow, forever, or until it can't. Japan offers a preview of what happens when growth stalls in a debt-based system. In the 1980s, Japan's economy was unstoppable. Its GDP grew at breakneck speed. Tokyo's real estate became the most expensive in the world. Japanese companies bought Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures. The country was hailed as an economic miracle. Then, in 1991, it all stopped. The asset bubble burst, stock prices crashed, real estate values collapsed, and the Japanese economy entered what's now called the lost decades. Not years. Decades. Plural. From 1991 to 2003, Japan's GDP grew only 1.14% annually. Between 2000 and 2010, about 1% per year. For comparison, China was growing at 8 to 10%, the US at 2 to 3%. Japan's economy essentially flatlined for 30 years. What's particularly disturbing is what happened despite Japan doing everything the economic textbooks said to do. They cut interest rates to 0, then below 0. They engaged in massive quantitative easing, creating trillions of yen. They spent enormous sums on infrastructure projects. Nothing worked. Because once an economy stops growing in a debt-based system, it enters a trap. Companies and individuals, uncertain about the future, stop spending and start saving. But in an economy where money is created by loans, saving means money is being destroyed faster than it's being created. Prices fall. Deflation sets in. And deflation makes debt more expensive in real terms. If you borrowed money last year and prices fall this year, you're paying back that debt with more valuable currency. It's like your debt grows even though you're making payments. This creates a deflationary spiral. People postpone purchases because prices will be lower tomorrow. But postponing purchases means businesses earn less revenue. So they cut costs, fire workers, and lower prices further, which causes more people to postpone purchases. The cycle feeds on itself. Japan's nominal GDP in 1995 was $5.55 trillion. In 2025, 30 years later, it's $4.27 trillion. It shrank, despite zero interest rates, despite unlimited money printing, despite every trick in the book. The economy could not be restarted because growth had become mathematically impossible under the weight of accumulated debt and demographic decline. Now, layer on top of this mathematical trap a physical one. The growth imperative collides head-on with the reality of a finite planet. In 1972, a team of MIT researchers published a study called The Limits to Growth. Using computer modeling, they simulated what would happen if population and economic growth continued on their current trajectory. Their conclusion: if humanity didn't change course, we'd exceed the Earth's carrying capacity by the mid-21st century, leading to potential collapse. The report was controversial. Economists dismissed it, politicians ignored it. But 50 years later, many of its predictions are proving eerily accurate. Resource depletion, environmental degradation, climate change accelerating beyond previous models. The fundamental insight remains true. Exponential growth is incompatible with finite resources. Consider the math. If the global economy grows at 3% annually, it doubles every 23 years. In 100 years, it would be 16 times larger. In 200 years, over 250 times larger. Are there 250 times more metals in the ground? 250 times more oil? 250 times more arable land? Of course not. The planet's resources are fixed. Some economists argue that growth can be decoupled from resource use through technology and efficiency. As economies mature, they shift from manufacturing to services. An app doesn't require copper and oil the way a car does. But this argument has two fatal flaws. First, even service economies require physical infrastructure. Data centers consume enormous amounts of energy. The devices we use to access apps require rare earth minerals. Economic activity, no matter how digital, ultimately rests on physical foundations. Second, efficiency improvements tend to increase consumption rather than decrease it. This is called the Jevons paradox. When cars became more fuel efficient, people didn't drive less. They drove more because it was cheaper. When LED bulbs used less energy, people installed more lights. Efficiency gains get consumed by expansion, not conservation. Global material consumption has risen in lockstep with GDP for the entire industrial era. There has been no meaningful decoupling. The economy grows, resource extraction grows. It's that simple. So why don't we just change the system? Why not build an economy that doesn't require perpetual growth? Economists have proposed alternatives. Steady-state economics, developed by Herman Daly, envisions an economy with stable populations and stable consumption. Degrowth movements in Europe advocate for intentional economic contraction in wealthy nations. On paper, these ideas make sense. In practice, they're nearly impossible to implement within existing financial structures. Here's why. Every major institution in our economy is designed around the assumption of growth. Stock markets reward companies that expand. Stagnant companies see their share prices fall, making it harder to raise capital, pay executives, compete. Pension systems assume investment returns that only come from economic growth. Retirees depend on their savings growing over time to fund retirements that now stretch 30 years or more. Government budgets rely on increasing tax revenues to service rising debt loads. Social Security, Medicare, defense spending all require more money next year than this year. Even if one nation tried to transition to a steady-state economy, it would face competitive disadvantages. Companies would relocate to countries still pursuing growth. Investors would flee to higher returns elsewhere. The country would be economically isolated, potentially forced to choose between maintaining its new system and participating in global trade. More fundamentally, the debt-based monetary system makes steady-state economics structurally impossible. If money is created as debt with interest, and interest compounds exponentially, how can the economy not grow? You'd have to either forgive all debt, which would destroy the banking system and evaporate savings, or create debt-free money through a fundamentally different mechanism. That would require dismantling and rebuilding the entire global financial architecture. No one with power wants that. Banks profit from the current system. Governments depend on it. The wealthy, whose assets inflate alongside economic growth, benefit enormously. There's no political coalition powerful enough to force change. because those hurt by the status quo are diffuse and disorganized, while those benefiting are concentrated and influential. So, alternatives remain theoretical, interesting ideas discussed in academic papers and fringe conferences, while the growth machine grinds forward toward its mathematical and physical limits. Which brings us to the unavoidable question. What happens when growth actually stops? Not slows, stops. When the exponential debt curve finally collides with the flat line of planetary limits. What comes next? History offers some clues, none of them comforting. The Great Depression saw GDP contract by approximately 30% in the United States between 1929 and 1933. Unemployment hit 25%. Banks failed by the thousands. It took a world war and massive debt-financed government spending to restart growth. The 2008 financial crisis nearly brought down the global banking system. Only unprecedented intervention by central banks, printing trillions of dollars, prevented complete collapse. Even so, recovery took years, and many economies never fully returned to pre-crisis trends. These were temporary interruptions, brief moments when growth stalled before being restarted through monetary policy, government spending, and new sources of credit. The endgame we're approaching is different. It's not a cyclical recession, but a structural limit, when you can no longer extract more resources at the rate required to service exponentially growing debt, when the environmental consequences of perpetual expansion become catastrophic, when demographics shift so that fewer workers support more retirees in an aging world. You can't print your way out of physical scarcity. You can't lower interest rates below zero indefinitely. At some point, the mathematical impossibility becomes undeniable. Based on historical precedents, one possible outcome is not a single dramatic collapse, but a long, grinding stagnation. Growth could slow incrementally, 1%, 0.5%, 0, then negative. Debt becomes harder to service, defaults rise, banks tighten lending, money supply contracts. Deflation sets in. This could mirror the cycle that Japan experienced, but globally, with no wealthy nations able to export their way out because everyone faces the same constraints simultaneously. Alternatively, governments and central banks might choose hyperinflation over deflation. If debt becomes unpayable in real terms, inflate it away. Print enough money that debts can be serviced, even as the currency loses value. This preserves the banking system but destroys savings and creates social chaos. Either path leads to severe economic disruption. The question isn't whether the current system can continue indefinitely. Mathematically and physically, it cannot. The question is how the transition happens. Whether it's managed decline or chaotic collapse remains to be seen. The growth trap isn't a conspiracy. It's not the result of evil people making evil decisions. It's an emergent property of how we structured our monetary and economic systems. Money as debt, debt with interest, interest that compounds. On a finite planet, the math was always going to catch up with us eventually. We've known this for decades. The Limits to Growth study warned us in 1972. Ecological economists have been sounding alarms ever since, but we've ignored them because facing the truth requires confronting an uncomfortable reality. The system we've built, the system that lifted billions out of poverty and created unprecedented material abundance, is the same system that's driving us toward potential collapse. We can't have endless growth on a finite planet, but our entire economy depends on endless growth to function. That's the trap, and we're all in it. If this gave you a new way of thinking about why the economy is the way it is, and why changing it is so difficult, hit subscribe. Understanding the machine is the first step toward imagining what comes next. Because something will come next. The only question is whether we design it or it gets designed for us by mathematics and physics.